It's a great pleasure to welcome tonight our speaker for the last in this series, Professor Lali Khalili, who is a professor of Middle Eastern politics at SOAS. And it gives me pleasure to read some of her publications, especially for students sitting here to know the range of interests and activities that she's been involved with over the years. It's remarkably varied. They include logistics and trade, infrastructure, policing and incarceration, gender, nationalism, political and social movements, refugees, diasporas in the Middle East. Her first book, which was published in 2007, was titled Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration. I use it in my teaching. The book drew on ethnographic research in the Palestinian refugee camp of Burj al-Barajne in Lebanon and focused on the particular genres of commemoration, from the heroic practices of the heady days of Third Worldism to the tragic discourses of an era in which NGOs are on the ascendance. She then worked on 2 edited volumes, which is a very heroic thing to do.
Glutton for punishment, never doing it again.
I'm sure. 2 edited, this is like torturous. The first titled Modern Arab Politics, which was published by Routledge in 2008, and the second co-edited with Julian Schwedler, Policing and Prisons in the Middle East, Formations of Coercion, which was published by OUP in 2010. Professor Khalili's latest book was published by Stanford in 2013 and is titled Time in the Shadows, Confinement in Counterinsurgencies. The book drew on interviews with former detainees in Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and various Israeli detention camps and prisons, as well as military officers, guards, and interrogators. She also used a large number of archival sources to show the continuities in practice of detention in liberal counterinsurgencies. Time in the Shadows was the recipient of 2 prizes, the Susan Strange Best Book Prize of the British International Studies Association and the 2014 Best Book Award of the International Political Science section of the International Studies Association. She has many articles, scholarly articles in Ijmas and comparative studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and comparative studies in society and history, Middle East Report, and in addition to many op-eds and articles in many leading dailies and weeklies, both here and in the US. For the past few years, Professor Khalili has been working on the political economy of maritime transport infrastructure, logistics and transport, with specific focus on the Arabian Peninsula, which I think is today the subject of today's talk, which is titled Thinking About Tankers, Labor, Port Making and Capitalism. So please join me in welcoming Professor Lali Khalili.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for being here on such a kind of nasty evening. I do apologize for arriving a little bit discombobulated and late. When I got to the station, there were actually no taxis at all, so I just had to cane it overland. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me, for inviting me. And what I'm going to be talking tonight about is something that is adjacent to the book that is coming out from the Maritime Transport Project. So it doesn't actually appear in the book. It's something that I'm hoping to develop more, and it's still quite a raw article. So I would love some feedback on it. And the aim of the article, where I'm hoping to get it published, is more of a sort of political economy type or economic sociology type journal. So it does cover quite a broad area, although, of course, inevitably, the Arabian Peninsula is going to be an element of it. Okay. So I want to start with a quotation from an article in the New York Times, which was published on 23rd of September 1956, when some of the biggest oil tankers were being manufactured and put on the sea. The quote says, "Just as the trireme, galleass, longboat, and clipper were symbols of their own maritime eras, so the tanker is the ship of our century." And in some ways, I want to start with that proposition. Okay. So in 1967, the British Transport Dock Board commissioned McKinsey & Company, who you guys know very well probably, their management consulting firm, to produce a report on containerization, the carriage of goods on containers, shipping containers. That year was a cataclysmic year in post-war British history. At the end of 1967, Prime Minister Harold Wilson had decreed withdrawal from the British colony at Aden, where BP, British Petroleum, had its largest refinery east of Suez, which was built there after the nationalization of the company's oil and refinery in Iran in 1951. Domestically, throughout 1967, dockers in Britain's two most major ports, London and Liverpool, had gone on crippling strikes to decasualize the hiring process at the docks. The way that it used to work was that the dockers would come to the port, stand outside the gates, and they were called on to come and work for the day. So it was quite casual labor. As the Minister of Labour of a Labour government, R.J. Gunther reported to the Parliament, and I'm quoting here, there's been a virtually complete strike of dockers in Liverpool and Birkenhead since 18th of September. In London, the Royal Group, West India and Millwall Docks, all of them now turned into banking or various kinds of gentrified posh places, and to a lesser extent London and St. Catherine Docks, have all been affected. These strikes, which are unofficial, now involve about 16,000 men and have caused serious interference with trade, in particular with exports. In this climate, containerization was seen as a major palliative to this unruly and intransigent workforce, whose demands for better wages and working conditions was eating into the profits of the shipping companies. Dockside protests around decasualization were restricting the circulation of goods and raw resources that had been so fundamental a factor in the post-Second World War boom in Europe. McKinsey's suggestions, however, were fascinating. They suggested that the mechanization of the docks via containerization, they argued, would better utilize, and I quote, material resources through improved process control. More importantly, McKinsey promised that, quote unquote, expensive labor can be replaced with cheaper capital equipment. Expensive and obviously unruly labor. End quote. The promise of automation as a solution to unruly dockers, McKinsey reasoned, was already proven in another maritime transport sector. And I quote, "The distribution of petroleum products is highly automated. The combined use of supertankers, high-speed automatic pumps, and large-capacity inland pipelines result in an extremely efficient integrated transport system." End quote. This capital investment inevitably drove a process of monopolization in business structures and economies of scale in the material plant needed for shipping. But McKinsey showed that in the oil industry, these economies of scale had resulted in a staggering cost savings of up to 30% per unit of material being transported. So this is, to me, really interesting, because I started off actually working on container shipping, and when I stumbled onto this McKinsey report, of course, being Iranian and intimately our life histories and having lived through the Iranian Revolution is intimately tied to the question of oil and oil transport. This was really interesting to me, that they were putting back the history of automation in the shipping industry, which most people locate with containerization. They were putting it back about 30 years to the emergence of tankers and pumping oil into the tankers. Okay, so there's an odd tanker-shaped lacuna in both the vast literature on petroleum and the growing corpus of critical maritime and logistics studies. The brilliant literature on logistics, and I here include the work not only of Deb Cowan in her Deadly Life of Logistics and the forthcoming research of Charmaine Chua on Singapore, but also the much older essays of photographer and essayist Alan Sekula, whose photo books about shipping and ports are some of the most amazing things you've ever seen. So this brilliant literature on logistics fits well into the renewed interest in histories of capitalism. But because of its emphasis on global supply chains and how it facilitates value in motion of finished factory products, the transport of crude oil, which is often a raw commodity, or even processed hydrocarbons, the stuff that comes out of refineries, are often left out of the story. In a vernacular sense, the aesthetics of containers, their geometric symmetries, and the dramatic vistas they produce on decks and docks also easily overshadow the inelegance of tank farms and the plain, low-slung liquid bulk carriers they feed. There's a member of audience here who took me on a journey along the coast of the eastern coast of the United Arab Emirates, and there's a complete aesthetic difference between the port of Fujairah, which serves oil shipping, and the port of Khor Fakkan, which serves container shipping. One is higgledy-piggledy and messy, and they're tank farms, and the other one is this kind of a beautiful, orderly, colorful, containerized space. There's an aesthetic difference, and I think that matters, actually. The scholarship on petroleum seems to focus on the production of oil, and the form of circulation most of interest to scholars seems to be pipelines. There's actually loads of books written about different kinds of pipelines and the construction of them and the ways in which their politics actually plays out in different ways. Only one historic monograph is dedicated to the development of tankers, though of course brief mentions are made in various histories of oil, while memoirs of Euro-American tanker captains and crews actually abound. So that's quite interesting. There are very few memoirs of container ship captains, but loads of tanker captains. Tim Mitchell's Carbon Democracy is an exception to the paucity of critical accounts of maritime circulation of oil. In a brief but incredibly perspicuous passage of about 3 pages, he outlines the way pipelines were intended to, and I quote, circumvent the wage demands of the teamsters who transported the barrels of oil to the rail depots in horse-drawn wagons. This is at the end of the 19th century in Pennsylvania. Nevertheless, as Mitchell points out, by 1970, maritime transport of petroleum and its refined products accounted for some 60% of global seaborne trade. So 60% of all ships on the sea in terms of tonnage carried oil or oil products, petroleum products. Mitchell also incisively and concisely shows that, and I quote, moving oil by sea eliminated the labor of coal heavers and stokers, and thus the power of organized workers to withdraw their labor from a critical point in the energy system, that automation thing that Mackenzie lauded. Transoceanic shipping operated beyond the territorial space governed by the labor regulations and other democratic rights won in the era of widespread coal and railway strikes, end quote. What I want to do in this essay today is to focus on these moments and places where such limitations and restrictions on the activity of labor worked, and other places where it didn't, however ephemerally. I will be speaking about the arbitrage on transnational wages of which maritime oil transport in its earliest days took advantage, and the possibility and limit political mobilization offered the workers who struck on decks and docks of tank ships. But tankers also underwrote other significant changes. The maritime transportation of petroleum and its refined products has from the very first foretold a number of disciplinary techniques central to the operation of capital. The distinctiveness of the ownership structures in tanker trade is perhaps one place where containerization has not followed in its footsteps. But in other areas, tanker transport has anticipated automation, offshoring, legal arbitration, and the centrality of speculative finance to its pricing, and by extension to the pricing of oil itself. Petroleum terminals were the first to redraw ports' urban maps in ways that are now familiar, with containerized harbors and dispute resolution over with containerized harbors being out of town. Also, dispute resolution over the circulation of oil has been a crucial element of Lex Petrolia, the legal and arbitral corpus that set the parameters of extraction and circulation of oil. And all of this itself provides the ground on which late capitalist legal property regimes are founded. What I'll do here is to trace these anticipatory moments in order to complicate the older genealogies and practices that are the genealogies of the older practices that are so central to our world today, and these being automation, arbitration, and offshoring. But to also illustrate the limits and vulnerabilities of this form of enterprise, which amalgamates extraction on neocolonial terms, value-added production characteristic of late capitalism, and mercantile modalities of operation. So this simultaneity is also of interest to me. Okay, so the birth of tank ships. The first ships carrying oil across the Atlantic were sailing ships with a cargo of wooden barrels, which is why we measure oil in barrels. And they were primarily owned by British trading companies who carried oil like they would any other cargo, in packets, so in barrels. Though the wooden barrels were later exchanged for tins that packed more efficiently, because barrels were round, and therefore if you packed them one next to each other, there were actually empty spaces in between. Whereas a tin was in a square shape, then of course therefore it packed. You could pack more of it, and therefore more also of fluid inside it. Though the wooden barrels were later exchanged for tins that packed more efficiently, the carriage of oil and other petroleum products in bulk across the ocean was still some time in coming. In the 1880s, even after sailing ships were fitted with tanks, about 90% of transatlantic trade was still carried in packets. And transatlantic trade was important because oil at that stage was really being produced primarily in the US, and its primary consumers, interestingly enough, were in Europe, not in US itself. The first steamers and steamer tank ships were deployed, however, not on the transatlantic routes, interestingly, but for traversing the Caspian and the deep-water rivers such as Volga in Russia by the Swedish Nobel family, famously of the Nobel Peace Prize or Nobel Prizes, who owned one of the largest oil companies in Azerbaijan. These ships, which were first floated in 1878 on the Caspian and Volga, were made of steel, had tanks that could expand or contract with temperature changes. They had ventilation to expel gases produced by lighter hydrocarbons. And perhaps most importantly, they had steam engines that operated not on coal, but on fuel, but the same fuel oil that they were carrying. So this was quite significant because this was one of the first moments where you had this transformation of engines, ships' engines, from coal to oil. In part, the innovation of using fuel oil-operated ships in Azerbaijan came about because in the US, Standard Oil primarily produced kerosene and was really not, until the end of the century, involved in the actual transatlantic shipping of oil to Europe, where the primary market was at that point. And for a few decades still, Standard Oil depended on English merchant marines who would rather convert their oil tank ships than to risk investment in the more costly and as yet proven tank ships that were steaming. So they preferred, the traders, the British traders, were much happier just using those old sailing ships rather than use steaming tank ships. The innovation happened over in Azerbaijan, not on the transatlantic routes, rather interestingly. And because Standard Oil had a monopoly, they didn't have to compete with anybody else on that route, and so they didn't feel also the need to look for faster or more efficient or cheaper routes. But in fact, it was an English maritime merchant house whose trade to Asia first tested the possibility of transoceanic tanker trade, so not across the Atlantic. By 1888, Standard Oil and a number of smaller British trading firms carrying the oil produced by the Nobels and the Rothschilds Benito Company had begun to corner the trade in Asia, in East and Southeast Asia. Marcus Samuel, who operated his own trading company, whose primary commodity was decorative shells, decided to break into this market, carrying Benito, Rothschild's oil, from Batum on the Black Sea to Asia through the Black, Mediterranean, and Red Seas. To do so, he needed to ensure that the ships in which he carried oil would meet the exacting standards of the Suez Canal Company. So the Suez Canal Company had until that point had not allowed any ships carrying fuel oil because there was worries about the volatility of the cargo. But for the transportation of oil in bulk to work, in addition to getting permission from the Suez Canal Company, destination ports also needed lots of the infrastructure. And these infrastructures included accessibility to road or rail or both, foundations firm enough for the immense storage tanks, enough room beside the storage tanks for the warehouse where bulk oil would be taken and put into barrels for transport inland, or for wholesale trade. You needed piers or jetties in deep water where the new large tankers, the largest in the world at that time, could come alongside. You needed also a good harbor where there was shelter from violent gales, Sumatra squalls, which could spring up unexpectedly at any time. So the infrastructure on the other end really mattered. So from the very first, tankers anticipated a form of vertical integration or integration along the whole transport chain, which has become the hallmark today of container transport. That meant that from the very beginning to the very end, the same company owned all of the infrastructure, the loading infrastructure, the shipping infrastructure, the receiving infrastructure, and not only beyond that, also the infrastructure needed to turn the bulk oil into retail oil and transport it inland on often carts, actually. Sometimes trains, but often carts. Even more importantly, one of the other things that was a factor in this was the national allegiances of different companies, which was in this case quite significant, because the Suez Canal's national allegiances were to Britain as well as to the Rothschild investors. Lloyd's of London's declaration that Shell, the company that Marcus Samuel had, was safe, and Lloyd's did so because Shell was a British company, and the ability to circumvent Dutch control and court British colonial officers in Asia all helped Marcus Samuel's Shell Trading Company to become one of the progenitors of a future oil giant. They got permission to go through the Suez Canal where nobody else would have gotten. In fact, Standard Oil tried to do all sorts of bribery and various other things, and they were turned down and batted away. And a lot of the archival documents show that, in fact, the Suez Canal's consideration was primarily based on the fact that Shell was a London-based company. By the early years of the 20th century, and this was quite significant because once you could actually cut out a huge amount of the route, then that became the fastest way to get oil from an oil region to East Asia. It was actually much faster than trying to get oil from Pennsylvania all the way across the land and transported across the Pacific. So this was really important, and Shell managed to corner the market in Southeast Asia, later joined up with Royal Dutch, which had the first concession there, and then they became Royal Dutch Shell. By the early years of the 20th century, and as sources of oil diversified, one of these sources being in Sumatra itself, and a concession given by the Dutch colonial government to a Dutch tobacco planter who then sold his concession to the Royal Dutch Company. And then the next concession, which was really quite significant, was the concession in the Gulf granted by Iran to the British in 1901, which happened simultaneously with Venezuela and Mexico. So these were quite significant moments. So the sources of oil were diversifying from Azerbaijan and Pennsylvania. The trade in oil slowly became more widespread globally and beyond the transatlantic routes. But it was only after the Second World War, the reconstruction in Europe and Japan, the war in Korea, and the rocketing of energy-intensive industries, not only in the global north, but in the newly decolonized countries of the global south, that the global trade in oil became the behemoth it did. Even in 1900, oil was only 2.5% of the world energy consumption, and tankers were only 1.5% of total merchant tonnage. But by 1938, oil had risen to 26% of the world's energy consumption, and tankers were 16% of the world's shipping tonnage. At the height of the oil boom, in 1972, nearly 60% of the world's seaborne trade was liquid hydrocarbons, though that percentage plunged after 1973 and today hovers somewhere around 30-35%. Okay, now, anticipating automation and urban transformation. From the very first, fuel oil-operated tank ships operated on the basis of maximal exploitation of ever-shrinking number of laborers. In fact, the success of the Shell Trading Company was largely predicated on a kind of wage arbitrage that today characterizes global production, shifting work from places with oft-unionized higher wage workers to places where workers are less protected and demand lower wages. The Rothschilds Benito Company in Azerbaijan wanted to open the Asian markets to their Azeri oil. They argued that the benefit of bulk transport of oil was that the oil could be unloaded and packed in the Far East, where, and I quote, an inexhaustible reservoir of cheap labor, end quote, could fill and pack unloaded oil in fresh, unrusted tin packaging ready for the market, instead of standard oil, which was coming in rusty buckets over from over from Americas. The British had not warmed up to the idea of actually giving up on these the transport of tins, and they didn't like the idea of bulk oil being transported and then packaged over in East Asia, because this meant that Welsh tin, which was at the time a huge source of production of tin, would be sidelined. And also because, of course, there were loads of British merchants who were serving Standard Oil. What finally persuaded the British government of the Rothschilds' plan was them pairing up with the British Shell Company. In the end, the venture proved highly successful. Skilled Chinese laborers in the Eastern and Southeast Asian ports manufactured tin containers, helped pack them with oil from the tanks, and transported them inland for sale. Wage arbitrage paid handsomely for Benito and Shell and opened new markets for oil. It was also in the nature of tanker trade that portside work could be automated from the first. For example, while emptying the hold of a ship from packages from barrels or tins could require dozens, even hundreds of stevedores, loading and unloading tankers required only 3 dock workers. One at the tank farm on the ridge to turn on the main tap, I'm quoting from a memoir, one at the switchgate manifold handling an intricate system of dials by which to guide the required product at the right rate to separate tankers, a task rendered recently more complicated by the export of refined products alongside crude, so 2 different tanks on the same ship, and a man in a little office on the jetty beside the tanker to supervise the loading, so 3 people instead of hundreds. In fact, this parsimony in the required number of workers was a major factor in Aristotle Onassis' decision after the Second World War to focus his investment on tankers, rather than on ore carriers or general cargo ships, as most other Greek ship owners had done. And as one of his biographers wrote, I quote, "Tankers were the most automated ships at that time. Hook up a hose, turn on a valve, and a tanker was loaded in half the time it would take to pack a freighter's hold, using clumsy slings and cargo winches. It took dozens of stevedores to load a freighter, and these men cost money thanks to strong unions controlling such ports as New York and London. Oil could be siphoned aboard with as few as 6 men, actually 3, if the unions weren't looking," end quote. The fact that the tank ships had fewer sailors, required fewer dock workers, and everything depended on the speed of the pumps, meant that the turnaround time at the port was also much faster. As a 1956 report on work aboard tankers commented, "At sea," and I quote, "the tanker man lives pretty much as does the freighter man, except that there is more of it. For the big tanker spends little time in the port. She's in this afternoon to start spilling out her cargo, and after 18 hours it is off again tomorrow for a month or 2, end quote. The quick turnaround time and intense work time at the port, the paucity of leisure time, and the distance between oil terminals and the city, they were often very, very far away, also translated into a life of isolation. The New York Times piece casts a less jaundiced eye on this life of solitude and relative isolation, the piece that I quoted at the beginning, the 1956 one. I quote New York Times. "One advantage in this way of life may be the money that it's usually he, is paid somewhat better than the freighter man, and he can save a lot, for there isn't much to spend his wages on. The oil loading ports in faraway lands are isolated, not near the white lights. A man can use up most of his day in ports, getting to and from the nearest hotspot," end quote. I've steamed on a container ship, and I can tell you that one of the most miserable things that the sailors complain about is the fact that they don't get any time off. Or that the turnaround time is so quick. So this is actually something that the New York Times is saying, woohoo, this is great. It's actually something that the sailors themselves probably find quite miserable. Both government and shipping company records show such turnaround time at the port of Bahrain, which was between the 1930s and the end of the Second World War, a major loading point for refined products from both Bahrain and the oil fields of Saudi Arabia before they built a refinery there in 1949-50. These reports, the government and shipping company reports, show that tankers could be loaded or unloaded and sent on their way in fewer than 24 hours. In 1957, the average turnaround time was already down to 18 hours. At port, tanker crew are required to be more involved in loading and unloading than on a dry cargo ship, and this also shifts the burden of work to the seafarers, again, away from others. Automation had always been the holy grail of capitalists looking to cut costs. Using pipelines certainly served this purpose. Standard Oil's pipelines cut out the Teamsters, and Nobel Oil's pipelines cut out the Cossack Arabe drivers of Azerbaijan. But the problem with pipelines is limitations on the size of the pipes, but perhaps even more significantly, the border crossings that make pipelines vulnerable to geopolitics. More significant still is that pipelines can be sabotaged, effectively acting as a kind of a choke point on production. Maritime transport, by contrast, can be scalable, more flexible in its carriage capacity, and immune to crossing contentious land borders. To make maritime transport of oil invisible, so as to immunize it against sabotage, oil terminals were also moved away from city centers. In both the case of oil terminals and container terminals, logical explanations abound for moving docks away from the city centers. More space for container storage, health and safety reasons for loading fuel on board ships, though actually crude oil is interestingly generally so heavy and stable that it's not considered volatile, actually, unlike refined products. And in fact, I've been reading all these memoirs of people who worked on both coal carriers, coal ships, and oil ships, and they were saying that coal produces this kind of volatile gas, which is actually more dangerous than carrying crude oil, because crude oil is much more stable. It's not the case with refined products, but it is definitely the case with crude. Single buoy moorings and offshore oil terminals both distance the loading and unloading of tankers from city centers, making the ships less subject to sabotage or attack, but also away from population centers where politically irrepressible crowds of workers can be supported by populations. This attempt to automate workers out of existence wasn't always successful. Even with a handful of people needed at the terminal, the oil companies had to contend with highly skilled workers who could down tools or even sabotage the very expensive equipment. Bringing in scab labor was also not always possible. During one 1968 strike, for example, in Qatar, the Qatari deputy ruler offered replacement workers to the oil company, which was a subsidiary of British Petroleum. But the oil company politely refused the offer from the Qatari ruler, partly, and I quote from the archival records, partly because marine operations could be dangerous with inexperienced workers, and partly because the company did not wish to provoke sabotage on its equipment, end quote. But also, oil brought out from underground is of no use if it cannot be circulated. And the shipment of oil is dependent not only on dockers, terminal workers, and seafarers. In 1961, during a 2-year strike in Doha, Qatar, and I have to say in the archival documents, what comes across as one of the most amazing and fascinating things is the extent to which workers in Abu Dhabi and Qatar were some of the most mobilized workers anywhere in all of the Arabian Peninsula. You're constantly reading about strike after strike after strike after strike, and these were actually indigenous Arabs belonging to either Abu Dhabi and Qatar, in addition to, in Abu Dhabi, some Iranians and Baluch, and in Qatar, Arabs from other places, but mostly really actually the locals. So in 1961, during a two-day strike in Doha, Qatar, pilot boat crews stopped work. Pilot boats are small, powerful boats captained by seafarers with deep and extensive experience of a given port's contours and dangers that help larger tankers come berth at the terminal. The strike of the pilot boat crews meant that although Qatari oil was produced, once the storage tanks at the Said terminal had reached their capacity, oil could be neither shipped nor could it be pulled out from the ground. This meant that the workers, in fact, had quite a great deal of leverage over how much oil was to be shipped. In this case, the oil company was so terrified that it actually mobilized the Qatari government, whose police force violently suppressed the strike, threw a bunch of people in prison, and actually injured some people, maimed some people who were involved in the strikes itself. And it was interesting because of all of the different strikes that I've been reading on these ports, this 2-day strike, precisely because 2 days was the limit of when the tankers would be filled, was one of the most violently suppressed strikes, which says something about how significant circulation was. So this is anticipating automation. A longer-lasting and insidious method of disciplining labor anticipates offshoring, and this was the introduction of flags of convenience. What flags of convenience are is essentially offshoring of shipping ownership. Open registries, where ship owners can flag their ships to a different country's flag, are called flags of convenience. In essence, that means that if a ship could be owned by a French company, in fact, the ship that I was on, CMA-CGM, my ship was flagged to Britain, so it had the red ensign, but loads of their ships are flagged to other countries, including these flags of convenience, Liberia, etc. In the words of the sublime John McPhee, who's an essayist who's written a lot about transportation, the convenience of these flags of convenience, and I quote, is that taxes could be avoided, insurance could be to a considerable extent ignored, and wages attractive to ship owners could be paid to merchant sailors drawn from any part of the world, end quote. The world's most famous flags of convenience today are Panama and Liberia, among many others, including Marshall Islands, Cyprus, Honduras, and Bahamas. And actually Jordan, which is quite a funny thing because they only have a teeny little port. But there are actually also landlocked places like Nepal who have flags of convenience. It's essentially a way of collecting fees on shipping. It's kind of like the Afghan Navy. The world's most famous... I read that. And what's interesting about most of these flags of convenience is that all of them are steadfast allies or clients of the US. Open registries, at the time of their devising in the early 20th century, were analogous to concessions granted to British companies by British colonial officials. In almost all of these instances where an open registry was established, a close client of the US, or in fact the US administrative government in its colonies, would grant these open registries to those countries. So it was essentially an overseas bounty given to a metropolitan company by the metropolitan colonial power at the expense of the overseas country. In Panama, Liberia, and Honduras, the companies set up to manage the ship registries were either headquartered in the US or operating according to US corporate guidelines. The most egregious of these was Liberia, where Edward Stettinius, formerly Franklin Roosevelt Secretary of State and later ambassador to the UN, after he retired from the UN, he set up a registry whose headquarters are still located in Vienna, Virginia, and who repatriates a substantial portion of the fees that they gather for registering ships back to the company, to the US. When the company was established in Liberia, Stettinius negotiated something with his pal, who was at the time president of Liberia, where 60% of the profits of the registration went back to the corporation, 10% went to a quote-unquote development fund, which he'd set up in order to encourage investment in extractive industries there, and only 25% was given to the Liberian government, most of which didn't actually reach the treasury. As Rodney Carlyle, the prime historian of open registries, writes, and I quote, "For public consumption, Stettinius promoted the operation in non-profit humanitarian terms. For others, for usually more specialized audiences, such as investors or Liberia company executives, Stettinius hinted at the profit possibilities in the rich iron deposits at Bomi Hills, which rivaled Swedish ore for its purity." And so the company was there combining shipping with extractive industries, which is about as old as capitalism itself. From the very first, extraction on colonial terms was interwoven with shipping it in the most exploitative, profit-maximizing form possible. The earliest ships to be flagged to the Panamanian and Honduran flags of convenience were the banana boats of the United Fruit Company and the tankers of Standard Oil. Standard Oil was the parent company of both Bahrain Petroleum Company, BAPCO, and of Aramco of Saudi Arabia. So the statistics from the port of Bahrain in the late 1930s and early 1940s show a large number of Panamanian ships regularly visiting the port of Bahrain and then later Ras Tanura. If in 1900, 56% of the world's oil-carrying fleet had been flagged to Britain and only 3% to the US, by 1948, 10% of the world tanker tonnage was carried on ships flagged to Panama. US-owned tankers dominated the flags of convenience. In 1970, 65% of all tankers flagged to Panama and 40% of all Liberian-flagged petroleum carriers were US-controlled ships. In 2018, the vast majority of the tankers in the world are flagged to the Marshall Islands, Liberia, Panama, and Singapore. International Registries, Inc., which operates the Marshall Islands Open Registry, also represents the islands as a kind of an ambassador in international maritime conferences. And International Registries, Inc. is also based in Reston, Virginia, another suburb of DC, kind of like the Liberian company. At various conferences that have attempted to limit emissions from ships in order to prevent climate change and attendant rise in sea levels, International Registries, which represents Marshall Island, has vetoed any effective action, ironically increasing Marshall Islands' exposure to oceanic inundation. So it's a really quite complex set of exploitative practices. Flagging ships to Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands is not the only way to hide incomes from taxation or polluting machinery from inspection, but perhaps more significantly, it is a way to pay crew members less. The absence of regulatory strictures means that the ship owners can set wages in ways that best benefit them. Onassis, for example, was known to pay Greek and German crews better rates than other nations, even if his crew members were underpaid in comparison with US, British, or Norwegian ships of the time. US shipping companies had already pioneered moving their fleets to flags of convenience, but when in 1963 the US Supreme Court ruled that maritime unions had no say in this, the shifting of fleets accelerated. In 1982, and this was incredibly profitable for the shipping companies. In 1982, for example, Exxon reported that a tanker carrying 28 seafarers had to pay $2.5 million in wages if flagged to the US, but only $560,000 if flagged to the Philippines, so about 5 times less. Beyond flags of convenience, the ownership structures of tankers themselves reflect the peculiarities of the age in which they operate. Vanessa Ogle, the historian of capitalism, has argued that offshoring has been a device to protect capital from redistributive demands emerging in the colonial era. Aside from flagging of ships to offshore havens with open registries, other techniques have also been crucial to maintain control of the Western companies over the resources of overseas countries. While John D. Rockefeller had refined the monopoly control, the guy who started Standard Oil, over downstream production of oil domestically, others had already begun to do so internationally. In the late 19th century, the Nobels of Sweden were masters of vertical integration of oil production and delivery logistics, controlling every step of circulation process, including not only the earlier tanker steamships, but also storage depots and oil terminals, tank trains, and repair yards. Shell Company similarly owned all the portside infrastructures it established for delivery of bulk oil in Southeast Asia, but also took advantage of the colonial infrastructures used for resource extraction in order to distribute oil from Singapore inland. Not only did Shell hold a fast grip on both ships and ports, this is also interesting, it even provided coal bunkering or fueling to ships in Singapore, thus ensuring total control over all forms of shipping business and sheltering its nascent oil distribution network from competition from other collier businesses. I mean, monopoly capital was absolutely central to the growth of these circulatory businesses. It took until 1919 before Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later BP, and other oil companies began to develop a worldwide network of bunkering stations to encourage the sale of their fuel fed by tank ships. And so the monopoly hold of certain companies over these ports ended up obviously benefiting them and giving them an advantage in those early stages. Facing decolonization, the oil majors were quite content to set any form of competition between them aside and instead build something of an iron wall against anti-colonial forces. For example, after Mossadegh's attempt to nationalize Iranian oil in 1951, and after Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal, the majors collaborated in, and I quote from a book that thinks this is fabulous, the magnificently efficient international distribution system designed and set up jointly by the Seven Sisters during those years, the Seven Sisters being 5 American oil companies plus BP and Shell. Crude oil production was controlled by them and efficiently regulated. Export liftings were run by them and the individual requirements of world crude oil buyers coordinated by them. Joint working groups assisted individual port authorities to plan and finance channel dredging, berths, tugs, and other services. The majors set up joint crude oil pipelines all over Western Europe, built and ran refineries both separately and together, even marketing jointly in certain areas. In many instances, they were not Seven Sisters, but one all-embracing mother. The international oil supply, I love the gendered language. The international oil supply network set up by them was highly efficient, and tankers were an integral part of this coordinated world scheme. The negative side of this cooperation was to be seen in the oil market, but in the tanker market, only the positive was experienced. The positive, of course, being the fact that they were making profits hand over fist, and they were completely shutting off anybody else out of that business. Oil company control over tankers wasn't the only modality of profit extraction. By the 1970s, 35% of the world tanker tonnage was controlled by oil companies, but they had found ways to protect themselves from actually the fluctuations in the market. The way that they protected themselves was through chartering or leasing ships from ship owners, and also throwing business the way of independent tanker fleets. In 1970s, for example, Greek shipping controlled 17% of the world's tanker fleet. And the Greek shipping then either chartered their ships for long-term to the oil companies or actually did spot or tramp business for them. Tramp business being you move from one port to the port, pick up the oil. It's not necessarily, it's just a single contract. It's not a long-term contract. Control over the means of transport also translated into sovereign control over one's policy of distribution. As early as 1959, an Arab nationalist lawyer of Palestinian origin working in Kuwait, who was later to become the OPEC General Secretary between 1965 and 1966, at the height of nationalization movements in OPEC, this guy's name was Ashraf Lutfi, and he wrote in a book called Arab Oil in 1959 that, and I quote, "Security for the future can only come by entering the business of integration," meaning vertical integration. "Tankers will ensure that oil can reach the buyers. Ownership or part ownership in refineries throughout the world will ensure the sale of products." And they were very, very aware that the sale of products meant value-added products. These guys were really aware that if you sold raw materials, you could be exploited and somebody else would do the extraction of value at a further manufacturing stage. I continue with Ashraf Lutfi. "If necessary, the owner of crude oil should also possess the petrol stations selling gasoline and lubricants." My father was a communist in Iran, and I remember very clearly that one of the things that he argued was that it wasn't enough to have the oil. That you also had to have the refineries, you had to have the shipping companies, you had to have the gas stations. Without that, somebody else benefited from all of those things. You only sold them the raw materials. Oil nationalists knew that controlling downstream businesses, where value was typically added, and the modalities of circulation were the necessary conditions for sovereign control over their crude oil resources. But even in 1976, OPEC nations only owned some 3.5% of the world's tanker fleet. So although they had the oil, and by 1976 much of the oil was now being nationalized, they did not have control of the circulation. Kuwait Oil Tanker Company was an historical exception to the OPEC producers not having control over their oil shipping. But the story of its emergence is in some ways the exception that proves the rule. Given how profitable tanker shipping had been in the 1950s, the oil majors who owned tanker businesses did not want competition from regional shipping companies. And the oil major at play here was, of course, British Petroleum. In the 1950s, Kuwaiti merchants decided that investment in a new shipping business could, and I quote, take the place of the slowly dying long-distance trade by thou. They felt that they had the shipping experience, access to capital, and a state-supported and protected market in oil, which made creating a national shipping company perfect. As important was the surge in demand for and production of Kuwaiti oil in the aftermath of the nationalization of Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and Kuwait's refinery replacing Abadan's as a source of refined products. So this was a moment where they thought they could really strike the iron while it was hot. The British, who controlled Kuwait under a protectorate agreement, at first balked at such a venture and denied permission for the establishment of a rival to BP Shipping, which, by the way, BP Shipping, which is BP's shipping arm, is the most profitable arm of the company. And in the 90 and almost 100 years that it has, actually more than 100 years that it's been in operation, it has had only 1 year where it has had a loss. So that's, I mean, how profitable these things are. Eventually, however, and because of the politics that was going on at that time, remember 1957 is a year after 1956 with the tripartite war against Nasser, which generated an enormous amount of anti-British sentiment in the Middle East. And so the British were really afraid of actually a revolution happening in Kuwait because the merchants that wanted to establish this company were very much the nationalist bourgeoisie, and a lot of them were Nasserists. So there is this moment of ferment going on. And so the British, who controlled Kuwait, at first balked. But eventually, both because they were trying to quell the nationalist sentiments, but also because they were hoping that the new company would order ships from British shipyards, they relented. Kuwait Oil Tanker Company was founded in April 1957 and promptly ordered ships from the Japanese Seisbo shipyard. From then on, the KOTC put its ships at the service of the Kuwait Oil Company, which was a joint venture between BP and Gulf Oil, under a time charter system which guaranteed it a stable income over time. KOTC also provided shipping agency services to other tankers visiting Kuwait, ensuring its domination of oil shipping there. Kuwait Oil Tanker Company's business remained fairly stable until the closures of the Suez Canal in 1967 dramatically transformed the physical structure of the shipping market, with larger ships becoming more prevalent. The nationalization of Arab petroleum companies and a surge in U.S. demand for oil in the early 1970s also saw enormous tensions in global petroleum shipping businesses. BP in this period refused to renew its time charter with KOTC, and only an edict by the Kuwaiti ruler requiring Kuwaiti oil to be carried by Kuwaiti tankers saved the company from bankruptcy. In the end, the market transformation of and that was in punishment for the nationalization of oil there. In the end, the market transformations of the late 1970s resulted in consistent operating losses for KOTC, and the company was fully nationalized from the merchants in 1979. The fortunes of a company owned by a national bourgeoisie was clearly hostage to the whims of the colonial master, who saw in the merchants' offer of a vehicle for the circulation of Kuwaiti oil a threat to their own businesses, and perhaps more so, a control over mechanisms and routes of circulation. So this is the ownership structures and how they mattered. There's another way in which, of course, oil matters, and that's the tyranny of oil circulation matters, and that's the tyranny of arbitration. The most effective method for protecting the colonial interests of foreign investors in oil and its shipping, however, has been commercial arbitration in tribunals, usually located in Europe or North America, sometimes through the auspices of World Bank's International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. International arbitration was seen as a bulwark against the possibility of sovereign post-colonial states nationalizing foreign assets or taking investors to court in national tribunals under their own national laws over unfair or corrupt practices. Though international commercial arbitration was long being institutionalized towards the end of the 19th century, and with the colonization and capitalization of the globe, the call for international arbitration by Western capital became much more clamorous in two specific periods. First, following the 1920 nationalization of Azeri oil, including the Nobels, by the Soviet Union, and especially after the 1938 nationalization of Mexican oil. So that was the first period. And second, in the wave of decolonization that succeeded the Second World War. after the Mexican nationalization, all oil companies added what they called stabilization clauses to their concession contracts, which, and I quote, froze the provisions of a national system of law chosen as the law of contract as of the date of the contract. So if you have a revolutionary government coming in, changing the law, which requires nationalization, that law skipped over. The stabilization clause says that you go to the pre-revolutionary law for arbitration, not what is current. In addition, they insisted on addition of international. They also began stipulating international tribunals as the venue for resolution of any disputes. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh had refused to allow international tribunals to arbitrate his nationalization of Iranian oil. In fact, he had insisted that that should have been arbitrated under Iranian law. But unfortunately, he lost out. Arguably, the moment during the process of nationalization of OPEC oil in which the most capitulation to the demands of international companies took place was when over the objection of the oil insurrectionists, the gradualists, including the more conservative countries of the Arabian Peninsula, agreed to, quote-unquote, moving all disputes to international arbitration. And there's a fabulous new book by Christopher Dietrich on the machinations that happened around this nationalization in the 1960s. It's called the Oil Revolutionaries. Of course, arbitration was not the only method used by the Anglo-Iranian oil company to punish Iran. The company conspired with all other majors to boycott all Iranian oil. There was clear knowledge that without tankers and without Anglo-Iranians' worldwide system of distribution, the Iranians would have no outlet for their petroleum. Not only did the majors boycott Iranian oil, but when a Panama-flagged ship, the Rosemary, chartered by a private Italian oil company, lifted oil from Abadan, RAF planes forced it into Aden Harbor, where its cargo was impounded. The hijacking of the ship by RAF had happened at the very moment when AIOC had forced Mossadegh to attend hearings at the World Court in The Hague. He lost the international arbitration case. It acted as a great deterrence against other oil companies loading crude in Iran. So you had law and coercion working hand in hand. The Iranian nationalization of oil and its strangulation through denial of shipping was certainly in the back of the mind of the powers in the US and UK, when Aristotle Onassis once again came to center stage. If you recall, Onassis had become a major tycoon through betting on oil tankers after the Second World War. Onassis's astonishing rise and rise through the prosperous ranks of global tycoons gave him a confidence that only one of the world's wealthiest oil companies could deflate. In the 1950s, Aramco, which was at the time a subsidiary of Standard Oil of California, had a concession from Saudi Arabia for the production of oil, but its agreement, the concession agreement, did not specify the terms of export. So it was very clear on where they could extract, but not very much on how they could ship it. Onassis attempted to subvert Aramco's monopoly over oil transport by lobbying the Saudi government and bribing some of its officials for an exclusive concession to transport the country's oil. This was too much not only for Standard Oil, but also for the de facto masters of oil in the region. For a time, fear that Saudi Arabia might follow Iran's example and nationalize its oil reigned. Why else would it want an independent tanker company? A motley group of concerned actors, from the CIA and the Dulles brothers to Her Majesty's government in London and the other shipping mogul Stavros Niarchos, all came together to defend Aramco against such impudence. Onassis's ships were boycotted by all oil companies, including Aramco's rivals. Diplomats and spies flew to Riyadh to lobby the king to withdraw Onassis's concession. As a last resort, Aramco lodged a case against Saudi Arabia and, by extension, Onassis in a commercial arbitration tribunal in Europe. A powerful group of European and North American jurists ruled against Saudi Arabia and Onassis and declared that its oil production concession agreement had given sovereignty to Aramco, literally sovereignty to Aramco. It was a decision that defended the rights of the powerful Western corporations against countries from the global South asserting jurisdiction over their own oil and control over the operation and management of their own trade. The tribunal decided that by signing the concession agreement, Saudi Arabia had ceded sovereignty over its oil to Aramco. Justice Stephen Schwabel, a former president of he became later president of the International Court of Justice, had been a young lawyer working on behalf of Aramco in that case. In a later recounting, he declared triumphantly that international investment law and its tribunals dethroned the state from its status as a sole object of international law, end quote, at exactly the very moment when former colonies became sovereign states. The coincidence of timing was no coincidence. In part, control over the circulation of oil was seen as the fundamental mechanism for the control of oil itself. After all, Mossadegh's nationalization of Iranian oil, if he could not sell that oil that was pulled out of the ground, what was he going to do? As it's famously said, what is he going to drink it? Arbitration was seen as a powerful force for the protection of foreign capital invested in former colonies, and such an early and decisive arbitration as the Onassis tanker case anticipated the primacy of this mechanism of discipline in the coming decades, and particularly after the fall of Soviet Union. Now, the last way, the final way in which tankers anticipate new managerial methods of disciplining labor and securing capital is through new modalities of accounting, financing, and financial speculation. The main costs in the movement of goods aboard tankers include wages, port fees, canal transit fees, and the cost of bunkering or fueling as offset against income gained from carriage of goods in bulk. In part, transformations in shipping have occurred because of the ability to cut back in some of these costs. For example, the switch from a coal bunker to oil aboard ships was facilitated by the fact that the smaller volumes of oil produced higher amounts of energy, leaving more room aboard a ship for cargo. The closure of the Suez Canal in 1956 and again in 1967 for 8 months and 8 years respectively forced ships around the Cape of Good Hope. What may have been gained in saving transit costs would be squandered in increasing fuel costs for the longer trip. Economies of scale dictated ever larger ships. The larger a ship gets, more can also be saved on the wages of crew. A VLCC, a very large crude carrier, equivalent in tonnage to 2 smaller ships, requires 30% fewer workers than the combined number of workers required on those 2 ships. But these much larger ships also cannot be accommodated on all routes or on all coasts or at all ports, so there's also a limit to how large they can get. Whether or not tankers can profit from carrying a cargo of oil depends not only on controlling costs, but also on what can be earned for that cargo. A ship can lift oil on a tramp basis, which means from any given port to any given destination, or on contract. If it does so on a tramp basis, a ship can buy oil cheaply and remain at anchor, wagering on an increase in prices before it delivers its cargo. When I was on the ship passing Fujairah, you can see about hundreds of ships at anchor outside of Fujairah. Most of them are on tramp trips, and they're waiting for even small changes in the price of oil, which will make actually the quantities of oil they deliver more profitable. So they just stay at anchor, and as soon as the prices change, they start steaming. The cost of transporting a cargo of oil can be added to the price of that cargo and calculated based on a given route, or it can be incorporated in the cost of the oil itself. So either you add it on top of the invoice, or the price of oil per barrel includes it. Pricing of routes is not straightforward either, and includes not only spot prices on oil, but also models that include predicted futures prices. Which port lies at the end of the routes and the length of the routes, whether the cargo is sweet or sour, meaning has low or high sulfur content, or heavy or light, which means its density, all of these things matter. The size of the ship also, of course, affects the transport costs charged. Oil itself is priced differently based on where it comes from. That's why when you listen to oil prices on business news, you hear about Brent prices or West Texas prices, etc. So there are different pricing structures for where the oil comes from. In 1948, when cheap Arabian oil was entering the market in volume, the majors that controlled the oil in the Middle East set it at the price at West Texas levels. What was interesting was that the cost of extraction of oil from Arabia was about, at that time, was about 1/20th of the cost of extraction of oil from West Texas. So they, in fact, by setting the prices at West Texas levels, they were ensuring both scarcity and extreme profits, obviously. The majors absorbed the cost of transport, but in so doing also retained control over the delivery of the oil itself by making their oil cheaper, having absorbed transportation costs. Further, the profits garnered from downstream activities and subsidiary companies were rarely included in the calculation of fees paid to the producing nations. It was one of the complaints that Mossadegh had against British Petroleum, that none of the subsidiary companies' profits were ever calculated in the fees that BP paid to Iran. So none of the profits from shipping, none of the profits from downstream, etc., etc. So in effect, this downstream was a very powerful way of also extracting profit. The financing of shipping also acts as a bellwether of transformation in finance and development and different trajectories of development worldwide. For example, support of the state was crucial for the creation of the Norwegian shipping industry in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. Subsidies, tax breaks, and a raft of other support, including abundant credit, was necessary for the creation of a steam fleet from Norway from scratch. Much of it was dedicated to tanker and bulk transport, and Norway remains, alongside Greece, one of the most major oil shipping companies in the world. Of great significance was the emergence of a new form of financing called charter-backed financing in the 1920s, which was first developed by Norwegian tanker builders whose ships were used by oil companies under time charters. This particular form of financing, however, was refined by the Greek shipping magnates, foremost among them our old friend Aristotle Onassis. What charter-backed financing entailed was the guarantee of a long-term charter for a ship, the certainty of whose income over a specified period secured the repayment of the mortgage on the ship. So time charters guarantee incomes for the ship because they're based on upfront contracts rather than riskier spot loading or tramp shipping businesses. You have one of these time charters, you know how much money you're making over the course of the next 5 years, if that's how long your charter is. Aristotle Onassis developed loan complexes that involved lenders, insurers, shipbuilders, and the oil companies that were his primary charter customers. Once he had secured a charter on an as yet unbuilt ship, he then went and obtained insurance for it and used the insurance as the guarantee to get a bank loan, which he then paid to the shipping company to build the ships. He was absolutely brilliant. I mean, he was cunning as anything, but he was the kinds of deals that he came up with were unbelievably well crafted. And of course, this became the norm in shipping until the 1970s. However, in the 1970s, commercial banks started switching from charter-backed financing to asset-backed financing. Asset-backed financing is, in a way, is a bit like getting a mortgage on your house, where the property itself ends up being the guarantee. Not the certainty that it'll work or you'll have an income, but the ship itself ends up becoming the guarantee. In some ways, this change had been in line with the financialization of capital that emerged in the 1970s, because an asset-backed financing deal is much less restrictive, and it doesn't need the buy-in from all of these different actors in order to do it. With the charter, shipping business and therefore income are both guaranteed, whereas with the ship as the security, there is no guarantee of a cargo for the said ship. The relaxation in rules of lending was in part a response to the oil boom of the 1970s, which saw a surge in demand for tankers and consequently for financing for new ships. It was also a response to the entry of petrodollars in vast volumes into the world financing market, which was, among other things, one of the triggers for what people imagined to be the start of the neoliberal era and financialization era. When the shipping cycle reached its nadir in the mid-1980s, many of the borrowers defaulted on their loans, and a great many ships had to be scrapped because they didn't have work for the ships. As Elizabeth Sibilia, a critical political geographer, has written in her Oceanic Accumulation, whereas charter-backed financing encouraged long-term contracts and stable development of shipping, asset-backed financing, essentially in a form of mortgage with the ship as the equity and guarantee, emerged in a period of rising oil prices, upward spirals in spot pricing, and thus intensive speculative financialization of the tanker industry. Another major transformation in shipping finance came with the 2008 crash. Whereas before the 2008 crash, no Chinese firms had been among the top 15 maritime lenders. The big maritime lenders are actually either British or German, or were British or German. The contraction in financing saw a number of long-standing European commercial marine lenders, including Britain's Lloyds and RBS, winding down their maritime lending business, while others reduced the volume of their lending, including Germany's Nordbank and Commerzbank. The Korean Export-Import Bank, which was already in the top 15 list, surged to number 5 in a 2014 shipping loan portfolio league table. It was joined by 3 Chinese banks, Bank of China, China Exim Bank, and China Development Bank. The geographic availability and sources of finance to shipping today also is a bellwether of the shifts in the location of capital worldwide. So in conclusion, in the three-decade period after the Second World War, European states and Japan built thriving social democracies, and decolonization in much of the global South brought with it intense, though non-linear processes of capitalization and industrialization. None of that would have been possible without the maritime transportation of oil. Even today, flying over Gibraltar or Bab el-Mandab or Malacca Straits, the profusion of tankers amazes. We often attend to the logistics of container transport because it's such a clear prism through which to study the global value chains. But the humble and too often forgotten tanker has anticipated the global transformations wrought in the 20th century more than any other. And more than any other, it has held a mirror to the techniques of control and discipline in response to mobilized workers at home and decolonization abroad. In her Accumulation of Capital, Rosa Luxemburg insists that imperialism is about 3 fundamental characteristics: of loans extended internationally, of extraction of natural resources, and of transport infrastructures that take the mined products to the market. In this instance, she was writing about railroads and the Suez Canal. The history of the tanker transport is in every way the story of the global accumulation of capital. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lali. I think we have some time for questions.
And criticisms.
Well, I gathered you saying this from the start, but just to be clear, so you would say effectively that the development of containerisation was directly facilitated by all the developments you just listed relating to oil tanking.
A lot of it is, and much of it is modelled on that as well. The question of automation, the question of, in many instances, of financing and various other, and some of the ownership structures, chartering, etc. But also there is actually very substantial differences in, and also the flags of convenience. But there are also some differences. So the biggest difference, I think, is the fact that many of the oil chartering companies that are Greek or Norwegian tend to actually do this business a lot more themselves. Whereas in container shipping, you have a narrowing of the number of shipping companies and constant narrowing. In fact, there's more and more mergers of big shipping companies involved in container transport. What you see in oil is that, in fact, it's actually becoming more and more diversified since the 1970s, which is quite an interesting phenomenon, actually. Yeah.
You mentioned, well, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. You mentioned memoirs of workers on...
Captains, mostly.
Okay.
There are some memoirs of workers, but by and large, most of the memoirs that European captains have written tend to be of people who actually also recount when they weren't captains, when they were also just workers aboard ships, regular seafarers, able seafarers, and then eventually become captains. And there's loads of those. There are very few memoirs written in Arabic or Persian about work aboard these kinds of ships. What there are, it appears as like a 1 or 2 page narrative in a book of oral histories about something else. There are loads and loads and loads of memoirs about people who sailed on those. There also tends to be, in a lot of these countries that have had and continue to have coastal dough trade, a kind of a slightly romantic orientalization of the dough trade, and so there's quite a lot of attention paid to it. There's historical gathering, like Kuwait has a dough museum, and it focuses really nicely and gathers oral histories on people who were seafarers on these kinds of ships. There are far, far fewer stuff on people who actually worked aboard tankers or container ships. Interestingly, though, there are lots of novels about tankers also. Thrillers, mostly. Really crappy thrillers, but thrillers nevertheless. So,
thank you for the talk. It was fascinating. 3 very different questions.
okay.
I'm wondering first about labor. So clearly, less people means less ways of exerting leverage, less people to pay. But I'm wondering what happens to labor politics with the tanker up until the contemporary period, if you have considered it, or even in the 1970s with the rise of the tanker. Question 2 is about the tanker itself. Who builds it? Do they all become standardized in a certain period? And which is linked to the third one. So I'm thinking here of sort of Keller Easterling's extra statecraft and QSO and all these organizations in Geneva that go about standardizing the size of ships, the size of container shipping. I know he talks a lot about. I don't know if he addresses tankers. And then this is all linked to this argument again about extra statecraft and how the sites of sovereignty are really these sort of odd quality standard organizations in places like Geneva. And you mentioned sovereignty in your comments, especially about what happens with Iran, and this sort of very cheeky remark about taking sovereignty from the countries once they're in the moments sort of the period of decolonization. So what's going on here with sovereignty? Who becomes sovereign? Is it all in these weird arbitration courts that sound quite shady and interesting, or does it speak to sovereignty in a different way?
Labor politics. With automation comes also a limitation on the possibility of labor organizing. But one of the things that I didn't include in here, but I do include in my book, is that actually the limits are not so much technological. So it's not a technologically deterministic thing that emerges here, but very political, in the sense that I mentioned that in the 1960s, and particularly between 1961 and 1968, as oil was becoming very central to the economies of these countries, that actually gave enormous leverage to both the dock workers and the seafarers that were working on the ships, both freighters and oil tankers. But the problem was that precisely because these countries, and during that period, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, were all British protectorates, the British were also very invested in ensuring that those kinds of labor politics did not develop into something more substantial. And so there were political modalities invented for limiting the possibility of labor organization. These included bringing in laborers from other places. It also included anti-unionization laws. So Bahrain and Kuwait both have unions, and in part they have them because these were sops to the early nationalist movements in those places. None of the other countries, Aden does as well, but none of the other former protectorates, none of the sheikdoms have them. And in fact, there are very explicit stuff that labor attachés wrote about what a mistake it had been to allow unionization in Bahrain and Kuwait, and that was never going to be allowed to happen in the sheikdoms of Qatar and what later became the UAE or Oman. And so the labor politics is very much determined by the political exigencies. That's also quite important because the labor politics was also not ever only about workplace issues. Although workplace issues were enormously important, there's again and again and again references to when these activists were organizing on the docks or in the oil fields. They were actually calling for their sheikdoms to become republics. And so that Republican fervor also scared, obviously, the shuyukh, and that was in part why there were limitations placed on most of the unionization on most of these places. Saudi Arabia, which was not a British protectorate, followed the same rule, and in 1953 passed a series of very draconian laws, which were then bolstered again further in 1956, which banned assembly, banned unionization, made them punishable by imprisonment, and various kinds of labor politics was very violently suppressed there, and Aramco advised them on how to pass these laws and how to create those limits. So the labor politics is interesting in that regard. There are two developments that are really interesting. The first is that, of course, Aden was an exception to this, and the anti-colonial movement in Aden was very much driven by the labor unions, and of course Aden being essentially a kind of a transit port of empire, the fourth most important bunkering port. The port workers, both dockers but also the seafarers who passed through Aden, Yemeni seafarers, had quite a an enormous amount of leverage and therefore had a major role in the nationalization there. A more interesting occurrence that I'm hearing about is the development of kind of state-sponsored unions in Oman. And the politics there are, the state-sponsored unions are very corporatist. They are not contentious. They tend to act more as liaisons between workers and management. But they are, I mean, this is quite an interesting thing that the port of Salalah now has a labor union. Where it will go remains to be seen, and I suspect that politics there will also matter greatly. And the second question, you said something about tanker ownership structures. So today, the vast majority of tankers are not owned by oil companies. The vast majority of tankers are actually owned by various kinds of independents. Some of those charter their tankers to oil companies. Some of them actually carry the oil under their own flag. And so the ownership structure is, by and large, very diffuse, very diverse. And the biggest owners of tankers are, as I said, the Greeks and the Norwegians. And then after that, others. And all of those Greek and Norwegian ships are actually registered to Caymans or Bahamas. So the question of offshoring still is quite important in the, not just flagged, but actually the ship itself is sort of, the ownership of it is corporate, is incorporated in places like Cayman and Bahamas. And so there's a way in which offshoring plays an enormous role in tanker shipping today, both in flagging it and in the ownership incorporation of the ships themselves.
Is the building of it also offshore?
The building of it is happening now in China primarily. I mean, obviously, the building has pretty much shifted entirely out of Europe. There are probably maybe one or two shipyards that are operating there. No, that's not true. There are more of them actually in France, in states that protected their industries, like France, to a lesser extent Spain and Portugal. They all do have shipyards, but the North Atlantic or the Northwest European countries and the Low Countries and Germany and Britain and the Scandinavian countries that used to be very, very significant places for building ships have pretty much lost all of their shipyards. That shifted first to Korea, where the shipwrights from Scotland went out to Korea and taught the Koreans how to build ships in the 1980s. Actually went to Japan, then to Korea, and now it's China. So shipbuilding is, most of the ships today being built are coming out of China. Standardization. So I'm not 100% persuaded by extra statecraft, by Easterling's argument, in part because I think that although there are these international standards, these various international, transnational organizations that dictate this and that, the primary power in those institutions happen to be the old school guys, particularly when it comes to shipping. The shipping finance, I did mention the rise of the Korean and the Chinese, but shipping finance is still primarily located in Germany and in London. Shipping law is primarily practiced here in this country. Shipping insurance is still completely and totally European, almost entirely actually operated out of here and Denmark. And then there's a question of sovereignty. And as I mentioned, these arbitration tribunals often hand over. There was actually a series in The Guardian, not about shipping arbitration, but corporate arbitration. It was a whole series between, I think it was in 2000, around between 2014 and 2015, which looked at the World Bank's investor-state dispute courts. And they showed the extent to which these arbitration tribunals almost always ruled for the investors rather than for the sovereign states. And this is quite significant because in the vast majority of instances, the investors happen to be European or North American companies. That is changing a little bit. And in my book, I actually talk about Dubai Ports World, which is the fourth largest terminal management company in the world, being one of the most litigious of these investors, and they have more cases in front of the in various kinds of arbitration tribunals, including that World Bank Forum, than any other company involved in shipping anywhere in the world. And that's because capital has shifted to some extent to something like Dubai Ports World, and so they do that work. Dubai Ports World is primarily owned by the Dubai state, which means that it is owned by Sheikh Mohammed. So in a way, sovereignty there is not in some transnational vague set of institutions. It's located in a very grounded form of capital that is difficult to prize apart between the state and a private owner. So,
Hi, can I ask 2 questions?
Of course.
One is related to standardization.
Yeah.
Was the metric system imposed on oil transport globally?
Mm-hmm.
Or did it matter? The second question is, what's the impact of the One Belt, One Road initiative that in the past few years that China is on petroleum port facilities?
Yeah. The metric system, interestingly, was significant from very early on, in part because the Azeri oil had been, and the Rothschilds, etc., had been so significant in the early stages of development of oceanic transport of oil. So the barrel mattered, and it still matters, where pricing is done per barrel of oil, etc. But when you're thinking about tanker shipping, they don't ever talk about how many barrels of oil is being shipped. The tankers are measured by tonnage. So that was from very early on. The tonnage was in the metric system, and that might have had to do with, again, the Rothschilds and the Nobels.
That's the metric ton rather than
imperial
metaphoric ton.
It's not the metaphoric ton. It's the metric ton. I can look that up, but I'm fairly certain that from the very early on it was metric ton, because the conversions happen in other settings, not with the Azeri oil shipping. The One Belt, One Road is quite interesting, in part because what the Chinese government and state-owned companies and semi-state-owned companies are investing in are largely either container shipping or extraction in various kind of raw material extraction in East Africa. And that means that they are not particularly interested in oil terminals or even bunkering terminals that much. And in part, I think that is because they're leaving that to their allies and friends in the Arabian Peninsula and across the water. That is also the case when you actually look at the route of One Belt, One Road, which the maritime Silk Route completely circumvents, completely goes around the Arabian Peninsula without ever touching it, while at the same time ensuring that it touches the places across the water on several different spots. So Gwadar in Pakistan, there were talks of going into Iran, but they're not now because Iran is making deals with India. And then, of course, across East Africa, all the way from Djibouti all the way up. So One Belt, One Road. But having said that, the Chinese are very, very present in the Dubai International Finance Center, and they very much use expertise of both financiers and maritime and logistics security people who are based in the UAE for their work in East Africa. So their alliances work in that way. And they're very cautious. It's been really interesting to me. They've been very cautious in not getting involved in the whole various kinds of rivalries in the Gulf.
Last question.
Thank you. It's always great, of course, you would understand, for me to hear about shipping matters, which normally you never hear about anywhere. So I just soak it all up. So thank you. It's great to hear. Just 2 things. I mean, interestingly, in view of the last question, of course, the containerisation industry still uses traditional feet and inches. I mean, the container is 20 long, which is ironic in view of what you just said. The One Belt, One Road, I'm not sure I entirely agree with you, if I may quibble slightly, because of course the One Belt, One Road, I mean, we'll see how it pans out in due course, but they are very much involved in Sri Lanka, haven't they?
Yes.
And of course there's huge debt, you're talking about costs,
yeah.
and money is a big part of this, and there's, of course, as you know, a lot of criticism, if that's the right word, about the extent to which they're getting all these countries into hock because of the amount of money. Like the Sri Lankans.
Pakistan, actually. Imran Khan has been saying that they're going to... But not the Arabian Peninsula.
But just let me finish. Gwadar is, of course, the other one I was about to mention in Pakistan, absolutely. But significantly, and nobody seems to have noticed this, the smaller ports in the UAE, places like Ajman, Ras Al Khaimah, and Al Quwain, no big players on the world stage. If you check up, you'll see that all three of them are now managed by Chinese companies.
But I think that's not new. And the management by Chinese...
It is fairly new, but I mean...
No. I mean, in the Arabian Peninsula, that's not new, because Hutchinson, for example, has been in Saudi Arabia for a really long time. And in fact, not only on the Red Sea coast, but actually even on the Gulf Coast.
I was about to say, though, I mean, if you include that, and then you mentioned Oman. I mean, also there's a lot of Chinese investment going on in Duqm, which is one of the ports, which is, and I've seen lots of articles talking about Duqm as being part of this Chinese involvement. And so I wonder whether they're in fact
doing it informally. That might be the case, because when I was that might be the case, because when I was in Hong Kong, I went to talk to some of the people that were involved in the what is it called, the overseas port investment, overseas maritime investment company, which has changed its name now, so that the maritime has dropped out. But anyway, so I talked to some of these investors, and they were explicitly saying that we will not be, so they will not have ports like in Sri Lanka or in Djibouti or Gwadar, where they are supposed to be Chinese ports. They will continue to have businesses all over, but they were very cautious about the question of sovereignty in the Arabian Peninsula, and they did not want to anger their allies there, which is in part why none of the countries of, none of the ports of the Arabian Peninsula appear on the One Belt, One Road map as part of that chain of different kinds of city-states or city ports.
Absolutely, but of course, as you know very well, in Dubai, I mean, you've got Dragon Mart, for example.
Oh, yes.
Which is, the biggest example outside China. I can't remember where it is, the big wholesale place in southeastern China, UA or somewhere like that. Huge Chinese distributed network as part of this sort of informal process. Can I just add one final thing quickly? You mentioned about the labour relations in Oman. I think part of the reason they've got unions, inverted commas, in Salalah, again, as you probably know, is that after the Arab Spring issues, in Oman there were demonstrations in Sohar and Salalah. And as a result of that, assuming he's still compos mentis, the Sheikh
Sultan Qaboos,
he made various concessions, and one of them was to liberalise the opportunities for jobs in Sohar and so on.
But the interesting thing about those, and in Salalah, the politics of those unions is particularly interesting, because the port managers the port managers are Dhofari nationalists, and the workers appeal to a larger Omani loyalty to the central state, the unions do. And so that is a quite interesting reversal of fortunes, where the management in the port claim that there's not enough Omani attention being paid to Salalah, and the union takes advantage of the fact that these guys are nationalists to say we are good Omani patriots and therefore our rights should be recognized.
But of course one of the reasons for that argument is that Salalah is run by Maersk, who have got a vested interest in objecting to other development in Oman, in Sohar and Duqm.
Yes, they do.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the questions. Thank you so much, Ali, for this wonderful presentation. I, for one, am very much looking forward to the book.
Thank you.
So please join me in